Brilliant, thanks all. Short, snappy question, and tell me if it's directed at any one of the panellists, please.
Hi, my name is Barney. I'm an artist from Hertfordshire. I'm also a secretary of a local flood forum, and I've been doing it for about a year. And what I've realised is that, like that chap just said, all you need is one policy, and that gutsy policy that works, and you wipe out all these symptoms further downstream that you shouldn't have to be dealing with, like having groups of people clearing up gutters and things like that, and that not working because people are parking because it's a commuter area and they want to park their cars, and so you've got to do this, putting on notices on windscreens and stuff like that. But if you have if you try and knock all that out, you can knock it out with just maybe a couple of gutsy policies, and get people putting putting out green walls and not paving their driveways. That's another big issue when it comes to flooding, paving their driveways, and capturing water before it hits these gullies and things that end up in your local streams. And we have terrible problems in Hertfordshire, our local chalk stream, which is quite rare, chalk streams. And we get our local Thames Water Sewage Board, they can't cope with the volumes of water that are coming down, so they've been pumping for, I think, up till during the last floods last year. They were pumping for about 4.5 months raw sewage into the chalk streams because they couldn't cope with the volumes of water, and that's partly, because people were paving over their driveways because there wasn't enough information. They didn't know any better. There wasn't enough information for them. That's just...
No, thank you. That's very local and very tangible. I'll maybe just see if there's a couple of other questions and someone can come back on that. Janet, here on this side.
Hello, I'm Janet Strachan with CDKN and here at ODI. I've got 2 comments and a question. Firstly, on co-benefits for resilience building, the IMF has done research that showed that the greatest impact on growth is the persistence of shocks. So one of the greatest co-benefits of resilience building will be improving the economic flow of resources and therefore building up resources for adaptation. On the resilience of businesses, I think one of the greatest challenges we've got structures in place for insurance for governments, not perfect by any means, but there is no equivalent for small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries. And I think there's some focus there that's needed in the loss and damage debate around what the needs are for insurance of small and medium-sized enterprises. And my question is around systemic thinking. If we look at the indicators for resilience, how do you get to that picture of what resilience truly is? Well, you can create a resilience index at the national level, and they have been created. The University of Malta and the Commonwealth have done a resilience index. But how do you translate that from the local level, the resilience of communities, which is really what you want to get at in the SDG goal, and build that into resilience more broadly into the national and international framework? That's a very complicated thing to do.
Quite a lot in your question there, Janet. So the panel, of course, can cleverly extract what they wish to from that. But I was trying to find the connection between Barney's very local points to yours at the global level, and the measurement and the issue of co-benefits. Does any panellist wish to pick up on any of that?
I'll take it there. So yeah, thank you. You raise a really good point about the systemic thinking. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it is really difficult. Measuring resilience is unbelievably tricky. And at Oxfam, we've got quite a lot of work trying to look at resilience at the programme level. So how is each individual programme on the ground building resilience for the people that we're working with? So, and I absolutely agree, that's the core of it. I think in terms of the SDGs, I think it's very difficult to try and capture that kind of sort of local level, granular kind of input. And so what we've suggested in this paper that you'll have seen we're quite restricted in the SDGs in that there is a real pressure to reduce the number of indicators within the SDGs. 169 targets, and they want 100 indicators. And they want to keep it simple because national statistical offices have to report against these, and national statistical offices in many countries have very few resources. So it is a real conundrum. What we suggested in this paper is that to build a resilience index, you use other elements of the SDGs. So many people think that social protection is a part of building resilience. And there's a social protection target in the SDGs. So let's wrap that into the resilience index. Similarly, things around health and education. You need health services, you need education to be resilient. So let's wrap those indicators into a resilience index. I don't think it's perfect, but I do think that it is a step in the right direction. And I think if we want to, we need to measure resilience bottom up and top down. I think there is no one magic way of doing it, but I think we need to do both. What we're trying to do is kind of work towards a sort of top-down measurement of resilience to be included in the SDGs. And what I actually think we need more fundamentally is a bigger discussion around what indicators can be used for resilience. So, and you may know that the sort of conflict and governance sector has also been looking for the right indicators for their work, and they've developed, the Statistical Commission has developed a kind of little subgroup to look at what are the right indicators. And I think we need something on resilience as well, that the clever statistical people and the sort of policy people come together and you know, spend 2 or 3, 4 years actually trying to figure this out, because this is not an easy issue, but I do think it's something that we need to address. But I agree, but I do think it needs to be top down and bottom up. I think just one doesn't work, but you do need both.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, the issue of scale at which you're measuring resilience and whether or not these kind of scales are compatible. And I don't have an answer to that question, but we're asking very similar questions through our work in the DFID Braced programme, looking at as Debbie mentioned earlier, the sort of capacities approach, so the absorptive, anticipatory and adaptive capacities of individuals to different kinds of shocks and stresses as a way of measuring resilience before a disaster actually happens. Are these capacities in place? But then also thinking about how these capacities can be measured in terms of different kinds of systems. So market systems, we're looking at livestock markets in West Africa, and with the intention of kind of knitting these two things together. And I think critically questions around gender are coming out as being really important as well. I mean, what does sort of building the resilience of women and children in some of the communities where the braced projects are working, what does that mean for the sort of resilience of the community as a whole? And these are some of the kind of questions that we're looking into. So no answers yet, but I'll keep you posted.
I just had a quick comment. I think at some point we need to stop looking at all the interplay of all the systems and sort of get on with it a little bit. But I do, where I would wholly support systems thinking is when you've got a system around which you can address that system. So an addressable system, it might be very complicated, there might be integrated parts of it, but if it's a jurisdiction in which a decision can be made and change can be affected, within reasonable timescales and budgets, then that's really useful because that's just how resilience is. So, yeah, my view would be, I think the meta-analysis can continue, but I like the idea, but I do think it needs to be focused a little bit. Otherwise, we've got too many smart people wrapped up in trying to think the unthinkable and not enough people getting on with 2016, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a scale issue. In the Gorakhpur film, which you saw earlier, it worked in a way because it was in that local context. And I think it would be very interesting to trace as that guidance of the approach taken there with the communities of external and local knowledge rolled out across other disaster management authorities across India to see how much uptake there will be. In relation to that, we've got a question from one of CDKN's partner organisations, All India Disaster Management Institute, AIDMI, and it's really just a general question on how resilience can be incorporated into local disaster management processes at district and subnational level. I mean, Kamal, I don't know whether you would like to elaborate further on that. I mean, that's the process which you started with, saying you're excited that uptake is happening, at least at subnational level. What's the way to scale that up without a sort of top-down approach and really maximise bottom-up drivers?
Well, I think, in India, even a sub-national level, which is, one level down, is a very large large area. But if we talk really local level, if we work with the existing systems, the lowest local level that we should work at is the level at which planning currently happens, and that's the district level. I think what the Gorakhpur film talks about is working at the district level. They are working with the district disaster management authority. So I think that is the for our context anyway, to sort of localize the notion of resilience within the formal state systems. That is a good level, because that's where all the sectors actually come together seamlessly. There aren't ministries at that level. There is one administration which is responsible for everything, and systems thinking. The previous speaker just talked about the notion of addressable system. In my understanding, for our context, that is an addressable system. A district, a level at which resource allocation happens, a level at which systems of planning happen. And if we can sort of begin to work with them on not just engaging with that planning process, but also in their own system of measuring progress, statistical systems. My hope is that in a few years, the district statistical handbooks in India that produce information on how much rice was produced and how much wheat was produced and how many children were born, we should have data on what did we lose to disasters. And once we begin to have accounting at that level, we are going to be able to make some progress there.
Oh, that's very helpful, thank you. Yeah, I've got questions here. You can take the microphone first and just say who you are first. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Nicholas Gall. I'm with the UCL Energy Institute. My question's for Mr. Dowling. I was just wondering if you could perhaps give like a specific example of like an instance where the private sector, in your estimation, has sort of come across sort of policy impediments or just like been unable to deliver some of the solutions you described there.
I'm going to leave the investment sort of industry to one side, but I think that's a huge area where there's sort of a lack of codes and principles, which effectively doesn't direct the investment industry towards making better decisions around resilience. I think one of the examples I might use is in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is landlocked, relies on particularly the port of Djibouti for its exports, and as a country it has some fairly tough trade-related regulatory frameworks. And I'm thinking about the upside of a corporate contribution to resilience, which would be a new product or service that is low cost and can target the poor and bring about co-benefits. So imagine a great product, whether it's some sort of water filtration system to allow for uses of different types of water during a period where there is a severe drought. The lack of flexibility within trade-related regulations and the lack of tariff alleviation for certain types of products that are intended for good, and therefore the misappropriation, just through a lack of development of the regulatory system, would mean that those products would either be simply unaffordable or uncompetitive when entering a new market. And actually, I won't pin this on Ethiopia because that's unfair, but it's fairly typical that a business will complain that in a range of markets it believes it has an appropriate solution for, it's simply unable to sell and operate in that market. So it's basically business regulation and trade and import tariffs that create a problem. I mean, that's a very, very simple thing, but when you've got a I'll give you one other quick example, just because it's a slightly different one. Special economic zones, of which 20 years ago there was about 100 or something, I'm approximating examples around the world where, of course, you have a set of incentives to set up new business and it helps agglomerate some growth. Not a bad idea, kind of works, great Kickstarter. Many zones end up being entire cities. Problem is, planning authorities often fail to place those special economic zones in valuable and resilient locations. And often those locations are available because historically they were unsettleable. So you put this bit of land that nobody's used because it's going to flood in a particular place, you encourage a load of business to come there, and you create such huge fiscal incentives that actually they set up there, and then there's also no framework to help them or encourage them to manage their resilience. And a lack of risk information and support, and if you like, a perverse incentive to locate there, creates a situation where the business is putting itself, its supply chain at risk, etc. And it's, yes, it's the responsibility of government, but it's an unfortunate set of circumstances that have come about, and it's difficult to unravel and unpick, and expensive to resolve if somebody realises before there's a disaster. So there's different ways in which this manifests.
Thank you, Dan. That was nice and tangible. Yes, that's a question. A couple more questions here. Let's do 3 questions quickly. 4 questions quickly, and I got 1 online. So hold on to these questions, folks on the panel.
Yes, Ulla Bargo, I'm an independent consultant, and this is a question for Mr. Dowling. Now you're talking about trade and investment. I just wonder if the Trans-Pacific Trade and Investment Partnership is starting to look at all this and whatever else goes on at WTO, and of course there's a transatlantic partnership also, but that's more for Europe. So in the Trans-Pacific, I understand that it's been agreed. So that will open up for investments and trade, and investors and tradespeople are doing due diligence and would like to make sure that their investments are secured, and that will require resilience, obviously. So I wonder if you have any insights on that.
Okay,
Thank you.
Just correct the question. Do you want to pass the microphone straight behind you? We'll just go quickly around and gather up these questions.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Beyer. I'm director of Beyond Sea, a low-carbon consultancy. I'm interested in translating the INDCs into some kind of implementation plan that's really actionable and that actually involves the private sector. So I'm curious to know how you think the private sector can really be involved in implementation of the INDCs next year.
Richard's down here.
Hi, my name is Richard Eubank. I'm the climate advisor from Christian Aid. And I was just wondering, resilience is usually built at the landscape level, particularly at the river catchment level. And quite often, the problems are that risks get sort of displaced from one part of the catchment to another. And yet it seems to me that the global agreements particularly tend to talk about resilience at a global level or at a local level or at the level of sort of district and national boundaries. And I was just wondering if the panel feel that these agreements have adequately sort of reflected this issue of the fact of risks and landscape-based resilience sort of cutting across these local and international boundaries. Particularly with respect to some of the big river catchments, such as the one we saw in northern India.
Yeah, that's a good point. Can we go 5 minutes over, Rob? Yeah, okay. So, because is there another question over there? Is there any other question there? Okay, I got 1 online. Are there any other questions in the room? I got 1 online. I'll put that on the table for you to think about, Kamal, because it's coming from Delhi. And it's directed at you. It's from the British High Commission, in which you emphasise the need for a national knowledge system for DRR. The key to such a system, Raj from the BHC writes, is institutionalising learning and exchange across disciplines and sectors. I think we'd recognise that. Can DRR research and planning be effective in bridging these boundaries in a country such as India? It's a pretty big one to finish with. But let's go to the panel here first. Landscape level risk, INDCs, trade. Dan, you want to start with trade?
Yeah, briefly, and I'm sure I won't fully answer your question here, but I think my answer is no. I don't believe it's firmly addressed. It's certainly not resolved, even if it's being discussed. And I'd be very surprised if any sort of WTO process is able to deal with this quickly. And the last thing we need is another global framework and all the rest of it to put on the table right now. I think what would be useful, because it doesn't rely on the trading framework, is improving the basic foundation and quality of risk information, so that any buyer or investor performing their due diligence can access, hazard, vulnerability, exposure data, both about the location they're investing in, the supply chain they're investing in, and the company they're investing in. And what would support that is better tools and better information, and potentially some sort of mandatory disclosure or corporate reporting around risk, liabilities, etc., which exists in some countries but not in many. Global norms and standards would be useful. Equator principles could be adapted. Let's not create whole new processes ideally, but just improve those. Shall I just pick up the INDC one quickly?
Yeah,
as
if you'd
well?
like to.
So for me, and everything I've said was deliberately provocative and a personal opinion, but the INDCs are a perfect example of the wrong sort of public policy tool for enabling the private sector and giving them any sense of what they could do to help within that. What it might do, if they're concrete, is create some policy certainty. If that's the route through which regulatory systems are really governed, but they're not. So the INDC is probably at best a direction of travel, and some of the key areas in which a proactive business might choose to come and get involved in supporting some of the solutions. So it could work, but it's just not clear enough what you should be doing, and there's no guarantee that those things are going to happen. What I would do is an INDC should really disaggregate into the normal regulatory structures and sector-related structures that exist in an economy, and business would then engage through those channels. So it definitely sets a tone at the top a little bit, but it's far too loose and compromised in a way for business to latch on.
With sort of due respect to process there, of course, Dan, Debbie highlighted the process of going from Sendai to the national disaster risk reduction law that Nepal is implementing, which could create, at least in that country, some kind of policy certainty if that law is well drafted and the regulations delivered. But of course, I'm just back from Colombia. There are plenty of laws and a statute book in a country like Colombia, but the regulations mostly don't exist. So that policy uncertainty, therefore, remains, investment uncertainty remains for business.
Codifying it or cementing it in.
So that comes back to doing something tangible. Kamal, let me go to you. There's a question about landscapes, but Emily might want to pick up on that. But there's that specific one really around knowledge systems and the research agenda to inform planning. It's a very high-level question. Is there any steer you can give us on that?
Well, I think there are two parts to that answer. The first part is that scientific and technical institutions, their incentive structure should be such that they are encouraged to work across disciplines. At the moment, they work, on their nice little, very focused projects relating only to their discipline. The second point is that to create that incentive structure, there has to be much better, much broader problem definition by people who are working on disaster risk reduction as such, as a discipline. Take the example of landslide risk reduction. The landslide risk reduction, you need Geological Survey of India to work on it, Central Water Commission to work on it, meteorologists to work on it, people who are doing research on infrastructure and road construction to work on it. But if we sort of came up with a plan that, in the next 10 years, all roads, all transportation in hills will be protected from landslides, and then have, a range of technical and scientific institutions coalesce around it and work on specific problem solving, then I think we can begin to nurture an integrated system of knowledge which works across disciplines and is focused on solving problems. The point on landscape level, I don't know what I can answer, but at the country level and subnational level, that realization is there for floods, for flash floods. A lot of the action is not actually limited to administrative boundaries. It's really on the basis of a river basin or a watershed, and so on. Thank you.
So I'll turn to other speakers, but I think there's one thing that I've learned today, that there's a real purposeful attempt to climb out of what could be a kind of Sendai box or silo to mainstream the use of the language of co-benefits, which we hear across the kind of climate conversation, is really what you're saying here, I think, across all of the comments here, and something that's tangible, that is seen from a development lens, not just a risk reduction lens. Emily, let me pass to you. Are there any particular questions you want to pick up on and sort of as closing remarks?
Yeah, just to add on the kind of building resilience at the river catchment or sort of landscape level, I think that's right. The global agreements are all focused on the national level, with some mention of sort of communities and what they can add to that. But that scale is not really reflected. I think it has to come back, though, to Kamal's point at being a sort of policy relevant scale. So if there is a subnational authority responsible for managing issues within that catchment area, then that organisation needs to be thinking about building resilience and measuring it at that scale as well. And if there isn't, then I think there needs to be a lot more kind of horizontal, joined up thinking. So I'd like to see more adaptation plans across different administrations, speaking to each other and looking for ways that they can actually kind of develop and implement the plans together. So I think there's a number of ways of doing that, but adaptation plans don't tend to be developed in that way. They tend to be developed by one authority to deal with risks in their own jurisdiction without recognising those kind of cross-border issues. So that's definitely something that could be focused on more when we get round to actually implementing some of the INDC, some of the adaptation elements.
Yeah, just one quick comment. I think it's been really interesting. Lots of different kind of ideas have come up today, and I guess I would totally agree with what you said, Sam, that I think that integration of risk across kind of policy frameworks and within business sectors is very important. And one of the things that we probably, certainly as a member of the NGO community, one of the things that we need to do is build up more demand for risk reduction from the people. So, in early April in Nepal, most people weren't really aware about building codes. After the earthquake, of course they are. And now, suddenly in Nepal, there was a real demand now for earthquake-resistant housing that wasn't there, on the 1st or 23rd of April this year. Now, that's an unfortunate way of building demand for DRR, but there is certainly, but effective. But what we need to do is build more demand for risk reduction, to work with our private sector, to put pressure on our governments and to properly integrate, because I do think that's very important. I'm very pleased with Kamal with what you've been saying about the work in India. I think that's fantastic, and I think more demand for that kind of work could be very useful.
So civil society often feels frustrated that it's not influencing the process enough. Think tanks like ODI sometimes feel frustrating not influencing policy enough. And Dan told us that 80% of the solutions sit with the private sector, and you think that at least the climate process has left the private sector out. The private sector, of course, will be there quite intensively in Paris, but you're quite correct. The negotiating text is pretty much blind to many of these other sectors in our society. And I think one can trust that the process is much more than the text. And the process has become more inclusive, and we want a text that's coherent for this action, this year of action and implementation in 2016, because we definitely need to raise the level of resilience. So we're seeing this as we speak, well, in the film and in the realities of people's lives as we speak today. So there's a huge job to be done. I'm sure everyone in the room is part of that, and I hope you'll continue to come to the debate. So to conclude, I'd like to invite everybody except Kamal, unfortunately, because it's hard for you to stay and eat lunch here, to stay and network. There's space out there. Do have a cup of coffee and another sandwich. There's plenty there, I believe. And thank you very much for your participation. But thank you particularly to Kamal for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
From India, and to Debbie, Dan and Emily. Thank you very much.